What's up, my fellow lionesses and lions? Welcome to the Project Lioness podcast, where we are here to disrupt the mainstream narrative when it comes to health, holism, and human consciousness. We are here to share bold truths about health and life from a female perspective. This episode is brought to you by our team, Inspire Co., where we stand for your health being inspired by choice rather than being inhibited by chance. Thank you for being here and joining in on these raw, real, and powerful conversations. We hope our show brings you inspiration and empowerment to overcome challenges, reclaim your life, and ultimately pursue your mission with power, purpose, and play. Now, let's get into the episode. All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Project Lioness podcast. This is one of your co-hosts, Dr. Mel, and today I am joined by and with Dr. Aryn.
Yes, hello, everybody.
Aryn's been here, y'all, for a year, over a year.
Over a year. January marked a year.
Yep.
A year
and
your
internship. Mm-hmm. So fun.
This year is very different because it's warm. It's about the same temperature as what it was as it is in South Carolina, where I moved from. Yeah, I was looking at it this morning, and the forecast looks about the same.
I know. I'm going to Florida in a couple days, and I'm like, maybe I should just stay in Minnesota for a day. But you know, there's an ocean there, so
there's an ocean. There's beach. There's good food.
There is good food. Mm-hmm. Seafood. Mm-hmm. Well, we wanted to come on here today and talk about what we've been up to as far as doctors in the office. Dr. Aryn has been giving so much over the last year, and specifically talking about kids and neurodivergent. We don't like to say disorders because you guys know us. We don't like to necessarily label things as bad, right, wrong, good, bad, right, but rather see these behaviors in kids and see these outcomes in kids as an opportunity to get curious what's happening in their body, in their brain, in their nervous system. And Dr. Aryn is definitely an expert in a lot of that. And we're making this podcast because many of you have asked and inquired to go deeper when it comes to the No Bad Kids talk that Dr. Aryn has been facilitating, which we'll drop in the show notes. She does that on the first Thursday
of every month.
Yep. You're all welcome. We love when parents come, when practice members come, when people, if you work with kids, I think it's a really great workshop. It's very informative, very inspiring. So we're making this podcast because a lot of you had deeper questions and we wanted to have a conversation about this. We also get that there's a lot of listeners here that do not live in Minnesota and cannot come to the live workshop. However, I hear that Dr. Aryn is potentially making it or having a virtual option.
Yep.
So stay tuned for that, y'all. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about kids. Let's talk about neurodivergence. Let's talk about how and where chiropractic fills in some gaps and what inspired you to talk about these things.
Yeah, I will start from the bottom. My inspiration,
just like the brain develops.
Exactly, the brain develops like a flower. Some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't, from the right to left aspect of brain development. Anyways, I was that kid, so I think I had some hesitation even starting this talk because I'm like, but I'm not a parent, so how do I speak to the parents about this? And then I recognize, but I'm that kid, and I'm that kid's voice to speak into that there's a reason behind every behavior. No kid is a bad kid. And it's let's actually look at it from a brain-based nervous system lens. So when I was a kiddo, I struggled with a lot of social anxiety. I was the kid at her own birthday party in the corner holding balloons, not talking to anybody. Couldn't really talk to strangers, would have massive freakouts. My mom would take me to QFC, and I hated
QFC.
Oh, sorry, West Coast.
Remember,
store,
y'all, Dr. Aryn's from Washington, so casually QFC.
I kind of forget that these stores aren't everywhere. QFC is kind of like an Ingles, so the store manager would always try and get me not an Ingles. Oh, that's South Carolina.
Like a Cub?
A Cub. Yep. There
okay.
you go.
There we go. We got it, you guys. We got the Midwest. Guys. Although those of you who tune in from different states, you're like, come on, Dr. Mel, figure it out.
See, I'm being inclusive to the whole U.S.
You are,
right now.
Yes. And we're going international. Okay.
Anyways, back to the story. I would go to QFC, like a cub. And the store manager would give me gifts and I would go into hyper freeze mode. And I wouldn't be able to communicate, I don't like you, I'm scared of you. And I would just like have these emotional outbursts afterwards. And my mom's like, what's going on? But I didn't know how to communicate that. And then I developed a stutter, later developed scoliosis, a lot of pain in my body, and just no sense of like where my body was at in space. And so how that translated into adulthood, because I didn't receive nervous system care until I was 18 years old. And then I left my hometown, went to college, and then it was another 4 years of inconsistent nervous system care. And my life wasn't as glorious as it is today. Who I am now is vastly different than like who I was as a kid. But I get to heal that inner child. And it's so fun to take care of the kiddos in the office because I see so many aspects of my own childhood in these kids. And it makes me feel even more inspired to like advocate for them and to teach about the brain and teach about development and just let parents know that there's a reason for it all. And let's dive deeper.
Right. And I think it can be so easy, like when we were kids, to just be like, oh, you're fine, right? Or, oh, that's just part of your personality or something like that. But in reality, you have to ask, okay, is it a personality thing? Or is it because there has been maybe trauma or root experiences in the body and the nervous system that then, you know, something you and I say is you don't grow out of things, which is what a lot of doctors will tell you, but you actually grow into them.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about why and how that happens and things to be curious about with your kids and not see it as like my kid is bad and they need to be labeled and they need to be suppressed with a bunch of medication, but maybe there's some gaps that the brain is, you know, seeking. So I'm curious. So you have done a lot of additional training in the Pediatrics Association Chiropractic, ICPA, right? And then also Focus Academy.
Yep.
So how has that transpired into not only the work in the office, but also into your talk? Like, what are some of the main things we can jam on today to inform parents that chiropractic is not just about back and neck pain and cracking necks, but actually brain health and development?
Yeah. So shout out to Dr. Amy Spolstra and her husband, Dave Spolstra. They're the ones who started the Focus Academy. And it's really looking at the whole brain development and nervous system from a very holistic lens. So kind of zooming out, understanding what all that development even looks like, and then getting very specific on how we can better support. So I went through that training about a year ago, and it's provided me with a lot of tools and insights because you learn a lot in chiropractic school. And when you get into real life profession, it looks a little different. Yeah. And so a lot of these like primitive reflexes that I test on, you can't test adults the same way that you test babies. True. And so I learned a lot of skill sets in order to do that. So my exam is so comprehensive in the fact that it's not just focused on kids, but it's also on adults too. So I don't just like turn a blind eye when you turn 18 years old and
you're good,
you're an adult. Like we don't have to worry about your brain development. No, I'm doing these things on like 70-year-old practice members because it still gives me a whole bunch of information dating back to basically birth and where there's gaps in that development and how that's contributing to their state of health in the today moment, right? Which is important, not just what's happening now and what did you do 2 days ago and how did that contribute? No, what has your whole life story been and how has that led to basically where you are today? So love that program and being able to speak and advocate for the kids and be able to connect with parents because parents are doing a phenomenal job. The stress in today's society is the problem, I guess. Yep. I guess you could say we just came out of a 2020 pandemic, you know, that lasted for several years and a lot of
who knows if we're even like maybe out of it. There's effects and consequences that are continuing that we're seeing now in the office with kids and people losing their job and kids. I mean, I know some of the stats that you share in your talk, like IQ points are down.
Just for the babies who were born during
Yes.
the pandemic.
Yes.
And that's just speaking to parent stress.
An acceleration of percentage of almost 300% of like increase of ADD, ADHD diagnoses or something like that.
Yep,
which falls under, by the way, the neurodivergent category has OCD, ADHD, ADD, like the whole alphabet soup, essentially.
Yep, sensory processing disorders, everything.
Anxiety, yeah.
Anxiety. Oh, anxiety is big for our
In
practice
little
members.
ones.
As like young as 3.
Yeah.
And I mean, kids are very unique in the way that they show anxiety too. So it looks different in them than it does in adults. So one term that I really like, or one phrase, is to name it to deflate it. And what I see happening in our culture is naming it to inflate it and identifying it as their identity.
Wow.
And I'm so like, no, it's not their identity. You're not an anxious person. You are a person experiencing anxiety.
Right.
So that's one thing that I am like super inspired to share more about, like to every person who walks through the door. It's like, this doesn't have to be your reality forever. This is just a symptom for the stress that you're experiencing in life. And let's widen your bandwidth to be able to manage that stress. Right.
That's fine.
Especially these kids.
I don't know if I've ever heard you say that quote. I feel like that's very profound. Like, instead of naming it to inflate it, and it's like, well, this is what you have and this is what you have to deal with, and therefore you have to take a medication the rest of your life, or you're always going to struggle, versus the deflation is like, okay, here's a myriad of things going on in this person's body, mind, health, relationships, social, mental, emotional, right? And just, okay, this could be the category. Let's put that over here, not bypass it, but say, okay, so how do we work with this differently? And like you said, help the brain widen its capacity, help the nervous system widen its capacity.
Yep. Well, and that's something that I've struggled with, is like, I can't do public speaking. Like, I get too anxious about it.
Just give Dr. Aryn a balloon.
Yeah. And I'm like, but that's not my identity.
Right.
I've grown and I've come so far, and I can do so many things that before would have like given me an anxiety attack leading up to it. And then I would have failed.
Totally.
Like, my thing was I would just completely blink. And sometimes that happens. And if it does, I'll laugh about it.
Yep.
And it's not the end of the world, right? But I have so many more tools now. And that's what I like to teach on, is that all these steps of brain development, which we can dive deeper in a second, those are just tools in how you process your world.
Yep.
So it's not like you don't have it, therefore you'll never have it. The brain is neuroplastic.
Yep.
I think that's what we also forget sometimes, that you have such a wide capacity to adapt and become more of a coherent and efficient human being in life. It's just giving you the resources to do so.
True. And I think people assume, oh, once you're at a certain age, then the brain stops developing. And it is true, the brain stops certain development. However, it does not stop adapting.
Yep.
And it's like a supercomputer sponge, where whatever new data you give it, it molds and it flexes and it brings, a filter of your past experiences and your current reality. So even clients and practice members we see who are 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you can still like adapt and change and mold. Now, when you're a baby and when you're a kid, your brain is way more sponge-like. It's like much more of a, not delicate flower, but it's much more moldable.
Yep.
Don't you quote like 75% by age 3?
Something like that. Yeah.
Is laid down. The wiring is laid down.
Well, and it's like if you're planting a garden for the first time, like you got to give it all the right nutrients and the correct sunlight, and probably plant it at the right time in the season too, right? So you have to make sure that the setting is supportive of the growth of that garden. Yes. And that's the same thing for the brain. But, if you did some things like incorrectly, or you notice that you could do things differently next time, it doesn't mean that you can't grow that garden the next season. You can keep it like refining it and making it grow even bigger and probably get more fruits and vegetables, right? So it's not like a death sentence. I think, like you said, it's just give it more nutrients. I teach on like the brain develops like a flower. So your nervous system, you have all these different sensory ways that you engage with your environment. So you take information in from your environment and you process it through your spinal cord. So I like to think of the spinal cord being the stem of a flower. And you send all that information up to the brain, and the brain's going to develop like that flower. So it's going to develop from the bottom up. It's going to develop from the back to the front and then right to left. So I kind of talked about that earlier where I'm like, that's less like a flower, but
flowers have to go some direction.
They have to
They're
go
probably
some
more
direction.
sporadic.
Yeah. But they're going to blossom. And so that's what we're doing with the brain development and providing it the correct nutrients and making sure that the way that the body takes information in and processes it is the correct information.
Right. So then in knowing that, can you walk us through some of the like specific developmental things that parents can notice? Because like you said earlier, not everyone is trained, number one, to look at these things.
Yep.
Number two, the way that you look at it, and I have training too. Aryn just says a little bit more robust when it comes to kids and brain development. But when you go to like a pediatrician or like a general practitioner, it's definitely how you do it as well. And like holding the space and seeing the whole person and understanding these things, even to how you do the exam, to how we bring people in through the office, because we understand if there's a kid coming in whose nervous system is at capacity and they've never been to a place, and we'll talk about this, that can be a recipe for even more anxiety. Yep. Versus like forcing a kid to go into a white sterile exam room is, boom, automatic, like fire alarms going off. Yeah. So walk us through, for parents, what are some of the things that we want to be looking at? And when there is incoherence or interference in that, how does that show up? So we can start to see these quote unquote diagnoses within the neurodivergent category differently.
Mm-hmm. So I like to kind of go through a brain trajectory sort of model. So when you're in the womb until about a year old, you're really just engaging with your primitive reflexes. Mm-hmm. You're very codependent on like mom, dad, or whoever your caregiver is, because you can't survive on your own.
You're reflexive, right?
Yeah, you're reflexive. You're in the survival state.
Yeah. Because I realize, I don't know if we've even broken this down. When people hear primitive reflexes, mm-hmm. unless you're a chiropractor or a holistic doctor, people may not understand what that means. So give us like a brief kind of, what does that mean?
Yeah. Think of like when the baby is breastfeeding, like a rooting reflex. If you've seen even like the fencer stance, and there's like, I test a Moro reflex. That's a big one that I test on every single person, which is going to be your startle reflex.
So the ability to experience real fear, mm-hmm. essentially.
Exactly. And be able to like protect yourself. Mm-hmm. So those are the main ones.
Reflex.
Sucking reflex. Yep.
Because you're literally, the way I think of it is like, if you're more reptiles or even like a worm, like you touch the worm and it reflexes, it like moves. And not that you're like a worm, but you do have lower brain systems that like it's stimulus response. Yep. And there's less processing happening in that like time period. So it's like, oh, touch the lips. There should be a reflex that is like, oh, there's a nipple, there's food.
Yep.
Like it's very like poop, fear, eat, sleep.
And all then the basics.
Yeah, all the basics. Is like when we say primitive, it's like the origins of your human existence.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I even think of that as just like brain stem, like lizard brain sort of function.
Right.
And these sometimes don't become integrated. Like I had a like sucking and like rooting reflex that I noticed well into chiropractic school.
I think a lot of the culture has it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is nothing against all y'all with those Stanley mugs with the big ass straws, but I'm calling you out that you might have some reflexes if you constantly need to like orally stimulate.
Well, and that's how I recognize mine. I'm like, I will only really drink water if it's through a straw.
Yeah.
Because just the act of like sucking through a straw is so comforting to me but I didn't breastfeed as a baby. And so I didn't get the opportunity to integrate that.
Stimulate the reflex.
Exactly.
And that's, by the way, I'm not calling you guys out if you feel like you need a straw, but just something to be curious about. Like if you feel like, I see this with people who smoke or they constantly need to be eating or snacking, or just like, for me, it does show up in more like when I'm stressed, I'll sometimes nail bite. I'm like, oh, there's the oral primitive
stimulation.
Yep. So this is what we're talking about, you guys, is like, you can see where there were maybe gaps growing up, things were not integrated and coherent. And so they show up as adults, but we see it as like, again, personality and not growing out of it. It's growing into it. So anyway, primitive reflexes.
And then from like a year to 2 years, that's going to be more of your motor, like movement and touch. So, I mean, babies, they start crawling, they start walking, they're touching everything, which can be
putting
stressful.
Things in their mouth.
Putting things in their mouth. Because that's now their next most sophisticated like tool that they have to engage with their world. So they got to touch and feel and basically send that information up to the brain so the brain can maybe store that. So in the future, when you're an adult, you don't have to touch and feel everything to know what it's going to feel like. Like I can look at this plant right here and know what it will feel like without having to feel it.
Right. They're mapping out the touch. If you guys look at the homunculus, if you want to nerd out on this, the homunculus is a depiction of the cortex of the brain. And maybe you guys remember this in biology, but there's like different parts of the body that map out how much essentially real estate that takes up on the brain. So if you remember like the goofy face, and then like the hands are really big, the feet are really big, the lips are really big, there's a lot in the face, but they're essentially mapping their world and encoding their inner reality with their outer reality. And so if kids don't get that physical touch, then that's where people, and you may talk about this and you've shared this in your talk, No Bad Kids, like the inability to know where they're at in space. So like dizziness. Hello, if you don't know where your body's at in space, you think you're going to feel anxious? Like 100%.
That was one of my biggest problems. I had no sense of body awareness.
And you'll try to stimulate or like move or like do your leg or fall all the time and get injured all the time. And then we just say like, oh, they don't pay attention in class. But actually it's like, no, their nervous system is in a total fight or flight response and they're trying to perceive their environment. But then what do they say? Oh, little Jimmy isn't paying attention because he's, stimming in the corner.
And we'll get to why they would start doing that too. And
sorry, I get ahead of myself and I get excited and I'm like, we need to know this, Dr. Aryn, tell us, spread the truth.
But it's so funny because like me as an adult, so like I know these things. So I look at my own like interactions with my external world very differently. Like I look at it through this lens, but if I notice I love Target. So say I'm in Target and I have to touch everything, like all pieces of clothing. I know that my nervous system is a little too stressed and overwhelmed and I'm not able to perceive anymore what that material feels like even though I've encountered it forever. And then I'll probably buy it.
Do you think Target knows that? Do you think they're preying on us?
That's why okay, I think Target actually listens to me, to be honest, not to put myself on a pedestal, but one day I went into Target and I said the only thing that they're missing are live plants. And then I swear to God, the next time I went to Target, they had live plants.
They have like recorders everywhere.
They have
store.
to.
I
They're
mean,
like, oh, Aryn, that's a really great idea.
And then it goes to corporate and they say, so this just in, we're going to make some plants and sell it, and make some profit on this girl.
I haven't received any profit myself though for the idea, but it's okay.
Rude.
Anyways, so the next stage of development is going to be auditory verbal. So that's going to be like 2 to 3 years old. So your kiddos are going to obviously start babbling a little bit more, but more in like cohesive language. They're going to be more receptive to what you have to say. They might be able to respond in like one-word answers, or they're fragmenting sentences, and maybe they are creating sentences at that point. So that's their next sophisticated tool. So that's what I like to say is sophisticated tool. So at that time,
brain tool, which
brain tool
translates to life because you live your life through your brain and your nervous system.
So at that point, what we see in the office a lot is around 3 years old, those kiddos are really engaging that like emotional system where they're having these big emotional outbursts, and you might start to actually notice anxiety in these kids at this time. And that's really because they're getting to practice their own emotional regulation without like separate from mom and dad, and they get to exercise their voice. And sometimes if it's not an efficient process, like if they're still living in like lizard brain, like in the primitive reflexes, that exercising a voice is going to be a little fragmented too. Which is going to come out in more rageful behavior where they don't know how to articulate what they're feeling and, you know, what's happening. And so they turn to hitting and screaming because that's more of a primitive reflex response.
Using more of then going back to the body, using their body to try to get their point across versus their voice, which comes from that auditory piece because we can hear ourselves make sound, you know, if we're not deaf, right? So, and even maybe there's a vibration with people who are deaf. I don't know. Be interesting.
Next stage, last stage of development, 4 to 6 years old. And we call this visual cognition. What this is not is your ability to see. Visual cognition is your ability to create imagery within your own head. So like when you ask little Timmy, do you have a bike? They have to create the imagery of like, what does a bike look like in their head? And they usually are not very sophisticated at this yet at like 4 years old, because this is a new skill set, a new tool. So they're going to have to go through the whole Rolodex of like, okay, I know I have rollerblades. I know I have a scooter, because they're creating these images in their head. They're probably looking at where all their toys are. They're like, okay, I remember this. I remember that. Do I have a bike? Is a bike there? And then it takes them a while usually to respond to that. This is just one example of very many sort of situations. If you were to also ask them like, what color is the bike? It's the same sort of process. So at this point, visual cognition it's probably the skill set that is hardest to develop sometimes, because we don't always support it in the best of ways that I'm seeing at least. So what you'll probably notice is while kids are in school, so school age, when you're entering kindergarten, 3rd grade, and then I would personally argue middle school, those are the most like demanding, stressful times of a kid's life. And it's because they're entering a very new environment that they don't have like a visual cognition representation of, because they've never been there. They've never been in a school setting, right? And the demands, the schoolwork, the homework are larger than what they've ever experienced too. And so moving through that can be really, really stressful. Some kids excel at it, so it's not to say that they can't, but it's just a lot of demand on these systems.
Well, and Excel is...
we could also dive into that too.
We'll dive into that, the hyper intellectualization and what we deem is of value in the culture, but is actually a detriment to human physiology. So continue.
Yep. So visual cognition is a challenging one. What I love to give this example during my No Bad Kids talk. I know when I go to Target, if I just need to get
Target
eggs,
on the brain for Dr.
I love Target, okay? I have to limit the times that I go to Target because that's my visual cognition.
Totally.
Painting the imagery of past experiences that most times when I go to Target, I get a little distracted and I buy things I don't need. What I've learned though is if I just hold something that I think that I want when I first get there and walk around the entire store, usually I don't want it by the time I circle.
You've got your fix.
Yeah, I got my fix. I'm like, I held it. I don't really need it.
Yeah.
And then I usually go
I
and
had
I
the
put
experience that my nervous system wanted the hit of dopamine.
Yep.
I had the experience and now we're done. Like I don't need another thing.
But I only know to do that because I've experienced experiences previously where that wasn't the outcome. And I knew that I didn't want to do that. Right. So
and you understand the brain.
And I understand the brain. So I go to Target for eggs, right? This task isn't very hard for me at this point because I've done this enough times, right? So I know I'm going to drive to Target. I know I'm going to park in the parking lot, and then I know I'm going to go into the grocery side of the store, and I'm going to go around the perimeter all the way to the back where the eggs are. And I'm going to grab the eggs. I'm going to go back to the register, purchase them, go home.
And some of you in this moment, as you're listening to this through your auditory, you also might be moving. Maybe you're cleaning your house. Maybe you're having some stuff come up and you go primitive, or you're like, yeah, and I bite my nails, or like moving, you know, whatever. Yep. So watch what your nervous system does with this. Cause for me, I'm like, as Dr. Aryn is walking me through this, I'm like, yep, I'm in the Target that I go to in Richfield, which is very rarely. But when I do, I'm like, okay, yep, I go to the left. So that's what she's talking about. Or some people can't do that.
Exactly.
Or that's the tool that they default to, but other tools are not. There's gaps, which is where the meltdowns can happen, right? And Dr. Aryn's going to get into like what you said, what that can turn into.
Yeah. So this tool, I mean, creating imagery is awesome and is challenging sometimes if you haven't been supported in that. So these kiddos, when you are maybe asking them questions or having them write down, like they're doing a writing assignment for homework, they're having to create that imagery in their head and then having to put it on paper, which is now becoming a gross motor skill. But it's mainly visual cognition because they still have to create the imagery of like the letters and the pictures and the words all onto that paper. So what you'll notice sometimes with these kiddos, if that demand of writing something down, of using that tool of visual cognition is a little challenging, they will onboard their other tools to help them complete that task. So for me, what I notice in my body is I like to move around. So the kids might be a little bit more fidgeting. They might actually lay down on the floor because now they're not having to recruit all their postural muscles to keep them upright. So maybe they'll lay down. They'll likely turn their head one way, so they're only focusing with one eye. So you're removing the demand of both eyes having to focus on one thing.
Which is why if sometimes you look in a mirror, your face isn't totally symmetrical. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah. I don't know if is that the reason?
Well, so and this may be coming from another chiropractor that I've mentored with, where if you turn to focus even slightly, you're going to use these muscles differently than these. So over time, those muscles can change the shape of your face. And then what happens is instead of retraining the nervous system, we inject things, we do surgery, we see those imbalances and try to do it from the outside in rather than the inside out. But I've noticed that with people where one eye is smaller, and that is part of that, like turning, like I'm doing it right now simply because I'm looking at Aryn. I'm like, oh shit, I'm fucking up my eyes. No. But it's just something I've noticed and I've learned from other chiropractors who do similar work with the brain stuff. So,
love that. I just learned something new today, you guys. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah. When I look in a mirror, it's harder, I think, to notice when you're looking at a human being, and I don't know why that is. But when you look at a mirror and it's a reflection back and you're looking at the person, I can tell big time in my face or other people's faces. So anyway, something to be curious about. And that there's nothing wrong with your face. It's just, you might be using your orbital muscles, right? Or your, masseter muscles or whatever differently. If you've had to orient your posture since you were younger to take in energy and information, which then is going to change how we use our motor system, your muscles, essentially.
Love that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Yay. I said something in this podcast.
Another thing that I notice sometimes if like the visual cognition is a little bit more challenging for me is I'll like bite at my lips.
Yeah.
And so I see that in kids a lot too. When I'm working with them on the table, they're like moving their mouth around. Sometimes they're engaging their tongue, and that's like that rooting and sucking reflex.
Yep.
So those are just a couple things to watch for.
It's also interesting to note beyond just normal brain development, when there's root experiences, i.e. perceived trauma, thinking about what position the body and the nervous system was in.
Yep.
And then that's what we also look at like on the table is like, oh, why is this person's hamstring so tight? Or why are their inner thighs so tight? And they can't allow their legs to open up, for example, maybe in a moment of time, they had to like move their body and nervous system into a state of protection. That's a whole nother podcast, but can relate to some of this too, you know, and there's associations that are creating, like if you had an orange bike and you got into an accident on your orange bike, you may associate, danger with orange bike. So if you ask a kid about a bike in school, let's say, and they have a more negatively perceived experience, you may not get the answer you're looking for. And then you may label that as something.
Yep. It's the same thing with allergies we're finding too.
Oh, dude.
That's a whole other podcast, but
you should speak to it though, because it's wild.
Yeah.
Wild. Wild.
Well, for me, when I was in undergrad, that was the worst time of my entire life with all the sexual traumas I had experienced. So I was not in a great place. Which in retrospect, I'm like, well, I struggled so much as a kid and then, you know, developed more anxiety and all these things. And then it even snowballed into sexual assault maybe. And I was just like in such a protective state. There's no way good things were going to come my way.
Totally.
I couldn't receive that in my life.
Well, and your posture was one of more protection and defense versus like open and courageous.
Yeah. I just watched a documentary that I participated in, and my posture so vastly different. My face shape so different. The way I talked. Yep. Insane.
Well, and I think
that's all your nervous system.
Yeah. And Kimberly Ann Johnson actually talks a lot about this, where when you can hold, and I know you guys got to come to the No Bad Kids talk, because Aryn's just giving you like a brief snippet. We also talk about how posture is more than just sit up straight. But what Kimberly Ann Johnson talks about too is your posture walking down like a dark alley emits a different signal. Actually, it's not a woo-woo thing. It emits a different signal to someone. And she calls it the jaguar energy. I call it the lioness energy. But when you hold yourself differently, you do like shift, you can impact the environment. Yep. Right. And this isn't to say like, oh, your posture is attracting negative things to come to you, and simultaneously be open to it. You know, like it's not that we're saying, hey, you attracted the trauma in your life, and simultaneously like be conscious of how, when you carry your body, what is your life like? Right. Like how you carry your body and your nervous system dictates what happens outside of you.
The shape, position, tension, tone of your spine determines the shape, position, tension, tone of your life.
Yep. And I get when I say that, I might ruffle some feathers, but you know, in reality, like we're not wishing trauma upon people. And we're not saying like you attracted this trauma in your life to whatever. That can be a form of spiritual bypassing. And there is something to like, well, what was the state of my life at that time? And what can I do differently? And, you know, this is probably for another podcast, but just something to consider of the vital importance of what you're speaking to for not only your life, but also your kids, right? Helping them feel more courageous and confident and authentic in who they are.
Yep. And like we speak to this because we've been through it.
Yeah.
We've been through the ringer, and here we are too, to be able to like speak on the other side of it in a higher state, which is powerful. During undergrad,
allergies though.
Yeah. Going back to my allergies, I developed I don't think I could call it an allergy, maybe more of an intolerance to bananas, to clams, and to scallops. And all that happened in undergrad. And I recently reintroduced bananas, and I can eat them. If I have a whole banana, my stomach still gets a little crampy, but it's far better than what it was. And then I just reintroduced scallops again. And the last time I had scallops, it was like a immediately like puking sort of situation. Last time I had clams and scallops together, it was out both ends kind of situation, and I couldn't eat for a whole week.
Use your visual cortex.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Imagine that. So I've been scared of them, and I recently also had scallops again because I'm like, okay, I've healed a lot of the root experiences that I experienced at the time that I developed this random intolerance. So let's see what my body does to process it now. And I was like, I don't have to go and see practice members tomorrow, so we're feeling risky.
Let's send it.
Full send. So JP and I, my partner and I, we went to get tacos and I had their scallop taco. And I was like, I don't know if I'm creating this like, I don't know, like pain in my stomach because of my previous experiences or if this is actually true.
Totally.
But I ended up like going to bed and then I woke up, it was probably like 1 or 2 a.m. I want to say. And I was like, I think I have to puke. And I threw up just a little bit. But I was so excited because I'm like, that's far better than what my previous experience was.
Yep.
I was like, okay, there's probably still some like rewiring to do within this.
Yep.
And I don't have to hold on to the story that existed before.
Well, how many people are like, oh, allergic to that, allergic to that, allergic to that. Like now kids have freaking 20 allergies and it's like, let's look at this differently. There's nothing, I shouldn't say that. Food nowadays is definitely grown very differently. I will say that there's different things in food. However, I think to what you're speaking to is really important of like what was happening in the environment in which the stimulus was introduced.
Exactly.
Or was consumed more often, because that's where you can see how your environment impacts your external environment, impacts your inner environment, vice versa. For me, it was when my parents got separated when I was like 4 to 6. This is so funny because so many people around me have fucking cats and more people are getting cats that are like close to us. It's crazy. And they often involve an orange tabby cat. Like I think Ashley has an orange tabby cat. Ben's brother and sister-in-law just got an orange tabby cat and another cat. You have a cat. It's not an orange tabby cat.
But she's calico, so she has some orangey in her.
Which is hilarious because when my parents got separated when I was younger, my mom got a cat to keep my dad away because my dad has really terrible allergies apparently. And I could live into the paradigm of like, well, my dad has allergies, so I have allergies, right? When in reality, not having my dad around and my mom being stressed completely impacted me. Like I remember that time being very unstable and tumultuous, and Simba, which is fucking hilarious. And I've said this before, that my 16-week program is called Project Lioness. Like just the synchronicity of everything is hilarious.
It's called balance.
Right, exactly. And I help people overcome their trauma. And in a moment I experienced a perceived trauma, which now I see the gift in it. There was little Simba, which is from the fucking Lion King. And so I have also attempted multiple times to rewrite that story and say, I don't have to like say I'm allergic to cats. I'm allergic to cats because I don't mind cats. Like I think they're incredibly intelligent and they are hilarious. So there's been moments where, you know, I've gone to like hold a cat, or we just had a cat in the office the other day and I went near it, and just choosing to rewrite it. But back to like the brain development, there's an allergy. Do you know the Allergy Institute that one of our practice members is going to out in California?
No.
They hold a very similar perspective where they actually, the way that they help kids override really extreme allergies is to almost microdose.
Yep.
Same. Like there was probably a moment in time that they were stressed out. Something was introduced in their life, which we don't need to go into this when it comes to birth and vaccines and, you know, certain whatever. But they are looking at it from a very unique perspective of not avoiding these things in your life, but like, how do you actually live your life and not have to live in fear?
Yeah.
And so they do like this long 3 to 5 year microdosing, and they get really great results. But back to the brain development, I don't know if there's anything to add on to that with.
Yeah. One thing that came into my brain is like, you definitely have to support the nervous system wherever it's at.
Right.
So it's like, what are your right now strategies to help decrease the stress, decrease the demand? And that might look like medications or doing things differently, kind of altering your life, modifying your life to make space for whatever this diagnosis is, whatever the issue is. But then also like see the long-term strategy. Like this is a right now modification so you can get back to who you authentically are.
Yeah.
So like, I think that's one thing that we do pretty well in the office too, is to hold space for the larger picture while simultaneously holding space for what we need to do in this moment.
Yeah. Not judging you if you are at a point where, my kid is on medication. Like we're not here to judge you, but we are here to inform you, cause and effect.
Yep.
Right. And if we can help your kiddo expand their capacity perhaps there is an opportunity where they start to become less reliant on those things. And this is not just kids, adults too. I mean, we see adults go off of medication all the time, but widening the capacity to be able to navigate things differently where you need less external resources because your inner tools are being fortified, so to speak. And we're not saying go eat a bunch of scallops like Dr. Aryn.
I've reached a point where I trust my body to do that.
But this is years of work that you've done.
Exactly.
And same with me. I never would have imagined, maybe a year ago starting holding that, like when people say, oh, you're allergic to cats, the self-righteous part of me is like, no, you need to say it differently. Like I have a response to cats, but I am not allergic.
You have an intolerance to cats.
Yes. And I don't have to, and that's me again, being like the prideful part of me is like, no, change your lexicon. But that's who I am. So,
and I'm starting a kiddo too, because like allergies, and I have to be very transparent. Like allergies are so complex.
They are.
And so I don't know. And let's hold the intention that anything could also happen.
Right.
It's like remove the stress from the body, and then the body can actually heal.
And what's your kind of statement that you say with kids, like the watch and wonder?
Oh,
right?
yeah. So pretty much everything that I spoke to is for you parents especially, and even for you as a human being, like watch and wonder. Whatever is showing up, just lead with curiosity. It's like you notice like different posturing, you notice maybe different like verbal things are coming out. Just wonder.
Yep.
Notice it. You don't have to judge it. Just see what's happening and then wonder, oh, what's that telling me about the stress or the demands that my kid is experiencing in this moment? And what was contributing to that stress leading up to that moment too?
And part of the questions that you're asking does require you parents to be conscious of your own inner child. Like Aryn's asking very higher brain questions. Watch and wonder does require you to be conscious of, well, where is my nervous system at? Where am I being reactive? Where am I responding in a way that is maybe childlike? And take a look at that for yourself. Some of the best results we see with families is when the families are under care, not just the kid, because you think your kid is broken, but really your kid is a mirror back to all the stuff that you have yet to learn to love and heal.
Mm-hmm. What did I say last night?
I don't know. It was profound. It was very profound. It was a mic drop moment. Yeah. You said something like that.
Yeah.
It was you were definitely channeling, and it was a download moment that you can't recreate. Yeah. And it hit the audience just like boom. You could just feel the energy in the room.
One of our attendees, I guess last month, she was just coming to learn how to support her grandkids, and she left, and she had, I guess, a profound experience, which I learned last night. She was crying. I had no idea, because she learned more about herself within this. Yep. So like I speak to this in terms of like, oh, the kids, but you were all kids once.
Yep.
As an adult, like I still apply this, and I'm still understanding my own development and how that's related to who I am today.
Absolutely.
Because you're a combination of all your life experiences. And within that, how your body was able to respond to those experiences.
Your biology is your biography.
I love it. I love it.
So as we wrap up this podcast, y'all, we obviously can't fit an entire talk in a podcast. We could, but we wanted to jam on this. Let's talk about resources that they can tap into as far as like, okay, Dr. Aryn, I hear you. I'm perceiving this differently. What are some resources that we can put in the show notes? Yep. I know you talk about specific resources in the talk. So if you haven't come to the talk, we will put the link first Thursday of every month, unless one of us is traveling. Yes. Honestly, you guys, it changes every time. So if you've come once, it's going to be a different experience. And I love it because there's also a dialogue that's facilitated among the participants. And it's such a way for parents to be like, oh my gosh, my kid does that too. I am not alone. And they're choosing to not let that become their reality and just like, well, this is how it is. Yep. You know, my parents had this, so this is how it is. You all are choosing to change the trajectory of your lineage, which takes courage. You're choosing to change the path, which is very inspiring. And that's why Dr. Aryn and I really want to keep providing resources, because we've done it, y'all. We've gone through the gauntlet, and we've got many more gauntlets to go through.
Oh yeah.
So let's talk. We'll drop in the notes resources. First, we do have a couple questions from the audience that we will answer really quickly. Because some of you are like, I have questions and Q&A. So we wanted to address those on the podcast, and then we'll drop in the show notes the resources, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, this is going to be a ever evolving conversation
Yeah.
because there's so many different layers to it and different
Layers and
experiences.
levels.
We joke though, the first No Bad Kids talk, that this is actually just a parent circle. Thank you for gathering.
For real.
We'll just let you guys figure it out amongst each other.
You teach the talk.
But truly, I mean, like Dr. Mel spoke to, it is a pretty empowering environment because it's not just me talking at you. Like, it's a very collaborative atmosphere for the parents to feel heard. And
It's an experience.
it really is.
It's not a talk. I think it's an experience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll receive that. Okay. So one of the questions we had was surrounding the
Hyper intellectualization. Say that 3 times fast. Say it.
I can't even say it once. Hyper intellectualization.
Boom! You just did it.
Okay.
And
I
you didn't
struggle with that
You
word.
didn't even stick your tongue out. Your eye didn't even twitch.
I think my eyes widened.
There's a bear.
Sympathetic response.
I love when you know this stuff and you're like, you're in stress mode.
My heart rate increased. I think my face is
That's
red.
the best that you have ever said that word. So
Thank you.
way to go.
Yeah, I'm on it.
Okay, so hyper intellectualization. What the hell does that mean? This is a kid who can have basically adult conversations with their peers and with adults. And they are super high IQ. They put a lot of emphasis on their intelligence when it comes to things like math, or just very intellectualized.
Let me interject for a second. These kiddos might actually struggle with peer-to-peer relationships.
That's true. I was going to correct myself there.
They might be the kid who does really great with adults or really great with younger kids, but not so great with their friend group.
This was like not totally me, because I did have a lot of friends and I felt like I was relatable, but this was definitely me. Like, I wanted attention from the older kids or adults. Yep. So I was the straight A student, accelerated really quickly, AP honors. And this is not to say that, that stuff is bad. However, we've created a culture that really puts that on a pedestal. And what happens is, Dr. Aryn talked about the brain development. There's almost a skipping of like the primitive and the somatic and the movement pieces, where these kids are very, very smart and very intellectualized, and they struggle being in their body. They have a lot of somatic issues. They have a lot of, I've worked with the kid now where they're just vomiting. Everything he ate, it was vomit. Like it almost like spit up like a baby, but this kid was almost 3 years old, but he could hold a conversation. I was like, dude, you're like really smart. And instead of me being like, wow, you're so smart, and not that he wasn't, but we want to amplify the intelligence of the body and the emotions as well.
Yep. The nervous system, you have to be able to perceive yourself first. So that's why we speak to the body before you can ever perceive other people.
Yes.
So you have to know your own emotional regulation states and be able to, navigate that before you can engage outwardly with another person and then understand their emotional state.
Yep.
And then once you're able to move through that, then you can create like peer-to-peer relationships too. So that's kind of why I speak to that. So being in your own body and knowing your body has to come before anything else.
Yep. And that there is a linearity to this, as much as it's like blossoming and evolving, and it can feel and maybe seem a little ethereal. There is a linearity. We're making up words today. That is vital to know and understand. But to your point, it is challenging to have social connection and regulate your breathing in your body, even in challenge, when you have hyper intellectualized. So this is also maybe, and I see this in some adults where they're super smart, but they struggle with like the social piece, or they struggle with their posture. They struggle regulating their breath in their body or sleeping. It requires you to relax into your body to sleep, right? So I think there's this trend of really putting that high on a pedestal, but people are becoming so disconnected from their body and so much more reliant on things to actually just navigate the human roadmap.
Yep. It's almost like a red flag for me when I hear parents say, yeah, like the teacher told my kid that they can move up, like skip a grade. I'm like, slow down.
Right.
Do they have
Like,
the
why?
foundational skill sets? And most often, I can't speak to a certain percentage, but most often I see that they haven't had like the primitive reflexes integrated, and even gross motor skills are a little rocky. And I'm like, okay, well, let's go back to the basics first.
Right. And like, I don't give a shit if you can do long division, if you can't do conflict resolution with your friend.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but like, that's shit that pisses me off. Now I'm a little fiery.
Well,
but
in this moment, I'm remembering when I was in middle school, one of my classmates, he was asked to move ahead in math, and I was pissed. Right. Because I was like, why did nobody ask me? Because I'm also really good at math.
right.
And I was like a 20-something-year-old with a sucking and rooting reflex still, you know? So like not fully in my body.
Yep.
And I was like, that's why I was so mad, because that's what you do. You hyper intellectualize, and then, hey, I said that good again. Okay. Anyways. And then you will default usually to those primitive reflexes because they're not integrated.
Yep.
So my integration of that was rage. I was so mad.
You know what I'm seeing a lot in the younger generation is they're very intelligent and they know how to like work the entrepreneurial system. They know how to use technology to make money. But they all vape.
Yeah.
And that's just sucking. And I'm like, yo, I don't care. You make millions, but your lungs can't work in 20 years. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, best of luck. Anyways.
So hyper-intellectualization, we can go on and on and on about that. You had one more question, then we'll wrap it up.
I know I had received a question like, how did you know you had a sucking reflex? And I know I've kind of tapped into that already. Just, I mean, I've gone through schooling and I've learned these reflexes. When you're in school, you get to...
She has years of training is how she knows.
Years of training.
Can invest in an exam.
Yeah. So that's all I got for that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, the truth is Dr. Aryn and I, and the purpose of this podcast too, is to teach y'all.
Yeah.
Because yes, we have had the privilege of being able to go to school, become doctors, have this sacred information, and it doesn't need to be kept behind white coats and like doctoral letters and stuff like that. We want to teach you. We want to teach you how to become your best doctor, how to become your best teacher for your kids. And so that's one of the purposes of this podcast, is to be real and raw and bold and courageous enough to share the things that I think sometimes is kept behind closed doors, because if it gets out to someone, then that means you become more empowered and perhaps you spend less money somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just the truth.
Yeah. And what we can drop in the show notes too is my ebook.
Yes, that will help too.
It's super comprehensive. I'll probably end up making a 2.0 like sort of version too of it at some point. But
of course,
what we didn't talk too much about in this podcast is that co-regulation. We did a little bit at the beginning, but there's even more in there about how you can really like connect with the little ones.
Yes.
Or even as old as like adulthood, to be honest. I kind of break it down into different categories, but when you're seeing these more like emotional outbursts, and I speak to that a lot because that's what we're seeing a ton of right now. What they need is connection.
Yep. They don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be told what to do. They simply need to be told and felt, I hear you, I see you, I get that you're frustrated, you're safe. Not that it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. You're safe.
Yeah. Because what's happening is the nervous system feels overwhelmed and it needs to be in a protective state. So we call that the sympathetic response. Yep. And in that, it could look like anything, but it's usually big emotions. Because again, they're defaulting to those primitive reflexes, to the lizard brain. And so we have to remind the nervous system that it is safe to experience those and to learn that like having rage and anger, like that's great. like experience that, because that is on the spectrum of human emotion. But how can we experience that safely?
Right. How can you widen the range to go from maybe instead of 0 to 100, it's 0 to 2.
Yeah. And like maybe not hitting people within that too.
Right. Like helping. And this is something that develops over time, but this is something we also teach to a lot at on our courses in the office, at our immersions in particular, is the ability to sense in your body into the sensations, into the somatic experience before it turns into an emotion or a thought.
Yep.
So learning to like essentially slow down time and become the master of your physiology.
Yep. And then like not having to judge it either.
Yeah.
Just allowing it to be the physiological like process that it is in your body.
Yep.
It's just a chemical process.
It is. It truly is. And we make meaning out of everything as human beings. So if you guys go further down in the podcast, earlier episodes, there's a podcast where we talk about the gift of anger.
Yes.
So there's 1 and 2 parts. And I know some of you have recently joined our Vortex, our Inspire Co Vortex, with all of these offerings, all of these podcasts. So thank you for being here and actually going back and listening to those episodes, because they're powerful. So
They are powerful.
yeah. Anything else to add?
I don't think so. I mean, like I said, this can be a 5-hour.
Probably a part 2.
Yeah.
We'll talk about some more co-regulation, but make sure you guys check out the show notes. Dr. Aryn will drop her resources in there. We'll drop the link to the next No Bad Kids talk. And we appreciate you being here. And any last minute?
No, just we love you and we support you.
Hyper intellectualization.
And I'm not doing it again. But hey, you parents are doing awesome.
You are.
Yeah. So this isn't like a shaming or anything. We're just here to, add more tools for that watch and wonder.
Watch and wonder. All right, you guys, thanks for tuning in. Until next time, peace, love, keep inspiring.
Bye.
Thank you for joining the Project Lioness podcast. Did you find value in today's episode? Help us impact the lives of others by sharing this podcast with someone you know who would resonate and benefit from the Project Lioness message. Excited to hear more? We invite you to subscribe on whatever platform you're tuning in on. And we'd be so grateful for you to leave us a review about what you enjoy most, as well as what you'd like to hear more of. Thank you so much for all of your support. Sincerely yours in power, purpose, and play. Dr. Mel with the Project Lioness podcast. Keep rising, keep roaring, and keep inspiring.